I'm Deance Gnolls, and tonight I'll be reading you The Emerald Succubus, Part 1. Pressing her finger against the bark of the corrupt tree, Ysera squeezed a globule of milky sap from the twisted giant, rubbing it ever so gently with her thumb. Looking back down the slope of the path briefly, she lowered the hand to her exposed stomach and smeared the sticky droplet across her purple skin, sucking in a sharp breath as she massaged it in, feeling the tingling burn. Unlike her sister Alexstrasza, the mortal side of the green matriarch was far less confused and unresponsive to the urges she sometimes craved. She saw the world in far more abstract terms. Having seen the dream, she understood just how many shades of gray comprised the complexity of the mortal life. There wasn't such a thing as absolute right and wrong, and being good sometimes meant being a little bad. While being bad could overlap sometimes to a little good. It was why, while her sister might have been abhorred at the shiver of pleasure Ysera felt from the burning caress of the fell sap, she was still able to relish it without any guilt or reprehension on her part. She wasn't afraid to indulge in her exotic desires for pleasure from time to time, and it so happened that she was on her way to satisfy them while simultaneously doing some good for the corrupted forest. Something good, which involved being a little bad, or at the very least bad in the eyes of those who were more judgmental than her. While the rampant corruption here abhorred her for what it did to the environment, it also fascinated her in a way that was in an opposite, contradictory counterpart to something she understood so well. She understood that it would fade in time, and there was very few things natural to Azeroth that held such mystery to her anymore. The environment here was such compelling to her as the allure of peering over to the brink of a torment volcano, and once she had begun to explore the dangerous possibilities of such a world, it was difficult not to continue to push through those boundaries. She reached the top of the ridge overlooking the road below, finding herself in a small clearing shrouded by skeletal bushes, hidden from sunlight by the thick canopy far above. In the center stood a rectangular stone altar, decorated all over with wicked demonic symbols etched deep into the stone. Nearby, she could see the signs of habitation, the animal bones discarded from meals, the embers of the previous evening's fire, and the thick scent of the demon nearby. "I can smell the forest on you already," the creature's deep voice crept into her ears as his clawed hand slid around her hips from behind. He was a satyr, red-skinned and broadly muscled, the dark fur of his beard brushing Ysera's neck as he slid forward to press his body against her. "You can't wait, can you? It's been ever so long since you came back," he whispered, snaking out his tongue to taste the underside of one long ear. She smiled to herself and allowed his hands to continue to roam, enjoying the unnatural heat radiating from his naked body. He was a lone demon named Ysera, and what she had come across him several times years ago, and she had learned that, while his intentions were no less wicked than the rest of his kind, the way he lived his life was not necessarily damaging to the forest or its inhabitants. She did not believe that every demon had to be put down just because it was a demon. "As long as you keep looking after your part of the wood for me, I don't see any reason why I shouldn't keep coming back," she said. Ysera chuckled, squeezing her breasts through the covering, I guess, as he explored the concave of her ear with his tongue more eagerly. "I think you should care about how well I keep the forest. You just enjoy the thought of a demon taking you so much to stay away. How jealous must all your whelps be that I get to have their queen." She felt her breath quickening as her body began to respond to his incessant touches, resting her hands over the back of his and twining her fingers in between those of the demon. "I care about both of those, but I know one's much more pleasurable than the other." She heard another rumbling snicker as his lips enveloped the top of her ear and began to suck on it hungrily. By the time he withdrew, she was trembling with excitement. "Dragon whore! You should have been born a succubus. I think you enjoyed it a lot more." "I might have," she gasped, leaning her head back on his shoulder as he bent in to taste her delicate neck, the horns of the demon and the dragon clacking together audibly. Ysera's hand slid down the front of her body and slipped beneath the cover of her leggings, his long claws prickling at the moist folds once they found them and rubbing agonizingly over her small pleasure bud. She inhaled sharply and let out a small moan of delight. She adored how precise and quick his elongated fingernails were to find that sensitive spot between her legs, tickling and teasing it as her teeth gnawed passionately at the choker around her neck. "Take off your clothes and get on my altar like a proper sacrifice," he whispered forcefully, kissing the markings around her eyes with his hot lips before drawing away. Burning with arousal, Ysera bent down to remove her boots, feeling the tainted soil beneath her toes as she wiggled her way out of her leggings. As she bent over to remove them, she looked back at the demon watching her. His gaze was full of wicked desire. Anyone else would have told her to get away from him. That his evil mind was ready and willing to inflict all sorts of horrendous acts upon her. It probably was, and that was one of the reasons she let him do this to her every time she visited. The thrill that accompanied the act that existed precisely because he was a wicked and evil creature, something unknown and fascinating to her. If she could, he would want to break and enslave her and use her for his own twisted gains. Of course, but he was such a satyr, and she was Ysera. The idea that a creature like him would only ever have his way with her if she consented to it added the ecstasy. She almost wished her brothers and sister were able to see as their mortal selves and relish this humiliation such a display would bring. She enjoyed being an enigma to her siblings, and this would make them question her in all sorts of new ways. Unclasping the back of her chest covering, she let it drop to the floor with the rest of her crumpled clothes, dressed only to her black choker as she paced slowly backwards toward the altar, letting Ysera admire every curve of her beautiful purple body, all the way to the loose green ponytail and the exotic pair of horns atop her head. She enjoyed the form of a female night owl very much, relishing the sensuality and beauty of it almost as much as her partner, who devoured every inch of her body with his ravenous gaze, the fur coating his loins, parting as his throbbing erection began to arise. Ysera clambered carefully up to the demonic altar in the middle of the small clearing, feeling her foot pressed down on the smooth animal bone as she hoisted herself up. What kinds of wicked rituals had Ysera used it on for the past? She ran her fingers over the carved ruins and laid herself back, holding out her wrists and ankles in the direction of the shackles fastened to each corner. Ysera stepped up to the side of the altar, running his lips across the length of her body once as he inhaled her scent before clamping the shackles around each of her limbs one by one. She writhed against the short chains, twisting her knees and elbows as she explored the limits of the bonds holding her against the stone-cold slab. She adored the feeling of helplessness it gave her in the mortal form. She had many partners who were willing to satisfy her at any time, but no dragon consort would ever let her feel as though she had no control at this. They all treated her with warm, gentle reverence. It was satisfactory for a dragon, but every mortal woman had the spark of passion lingering in her that desired something more, a heat and an intensity for the act. "What am I going to do with you this time, my emerald princess?" Ysera murmured, squeezing her thigh. "Should I whip you like last time? We could drive the birds from the trees with your screams again if you'd like. Or I could call them those poor, corrupted bears and wolves. They're always more than happy for the smallest bit of pleasure they can get in their miserable lives." He bent over her and traced a claw through the sticky residue of the saps still lingering on her stomach. "But you're in the mood for more than that, aren't you? You really do wish you had the fell blood burning in your veins like a real succubus. I think you're in the mood for a real corruption." He caught the chain piercing tracing from her navel in between two claws, tugging it upward and drawing a gasp from Ysera as she arched her back in response. He continued to play with it between his fingers, gently twisting her piercing this way and that as he continued. "I always wondered why you had this. You like to decorate yourself, don't you? Well, why don't I decorate you properly? Why don't I make you my succubus tonight?" Ysera heaved himself up on the top of the altar, straddling her with his muscular thighs on either side of her hips, their warm fur tickling her skin. Though his large erection jutted out inches above her body, he made no move to enter her yet. Both of them were just breathing heavily with desire, but it wasn't just the act of itself that they were waiting to enjoy. He seemed to linger, looking down at her with a heavy, wicked smile, until Ysera finally relented and spoke. "Make me your succubus, master. Please make me your wicked whore. Do all the evil things you want to." She bucked against him, moaning with lust. She was yearning to know what he was going to do with her, eager to be as bad as she could. "Good. Now hold still and let's mark you as mine." Leaning back, Ysera placed a hand on her hip, lowering the other to hold the claw of his index finger poised over her body, teasing the chain of her piercing to the side before pressing the sharp point down against the soft purple skin of her stomach. His touch burned her, a deep searing pain in her abdomen that was almost agonizing. But as she grit her teeth and strained against her bonds, Ysera felt a deeper sensation in her belly, an intense stirring that left a whimper of pleasure on her lips. She wanted to pull away from the pain, but the desire feeling it brought with it was one of the most impending climax. A constant nagging that a few more seconds of his touch would push her over the edge. Ysera, obviously deriving immense satisfaction from that response, slowly drew his claw around her stomach in a large circle, creating a precise black mark on the aspect's skin in its wake. Once he had described the circle in her stomach, he continued, drawing one horizontal line after another from one side of the circle to the next until he had marked her with a demonic hexagram, taking his time to add in extra lines that crossed over her navel in the center, and enjoying every spasm of her body as he prolonged the experience. Ysera's eyes were screwed shut, groaning in exquisite agony as she writhed against the chains, hoping every second that the next moment would bring her release. When the satyr finally withdrew his claw, she couldn't help but whimper with disappointment, feeling all the pent-up desire in her belly slowly drifting away without having been fulfilled. "Don't worry, my pet, I'll let you come, but only when I say you can. Do you like your mark?" Panting desperately, Ysera craned her neck to stare at the black symbol he had drawn on her body. He could have chosen anything, but the mark that he had selected in particular filled her with a distinct sense of wickedness. She felt devilishly naughty, branded with a demonic symbol that held obvious connotations with an evil mystique to anyone who set eyes on it. She was almost beginning to feel like a real succubus. Ysera snapped his fingers in front of his face, drawing her attention up to him. He held up his thumb and forefinger an inch apart, and slowly, deliberately pressed them together. As the two digits were about to touch, Ysera caught sight of a faint orange spark dancing between them, before the familiar agony she had felt in her stomach returned. Her hexagon symbol blazed the color of flame, and she drew back her head as the sensation filled her once again, magnified over and over. Every single line burned at the same time. She wailed in pain and pleasure, feeling for sure this time she would climax at any moment. But once again, the feeling ended as quickly as it had begun, the mark on her body dimming as Ysera drew his thumb and forefinger apart. He seized her chin, dragging his head up to look at him, as she blinked through teary eyes. "That's how it feels to be a demon. I'll make you wicked, and I'll make you do wicked things." "Please make me," she groaned, bucking up against him again. "Not yet. First you need to look like a demon whore." Letting go of her, he leaned forward, taking one of Ysera's hands in his, and bending her fingers over so that he could examine the aspect set of pristine nails. One thing at a time. Touching her nails one by one, the faint purple coloring faded and was replaced with a dark onyx sheen. She felt them lengthen, the points becoming slightly more pronounced until every fingernail had been lengthened and darkened. Shifting back, Ysera then repeated the process with her toes. Now to correct those horns. Panting with excitement, Ysera dug her new fingernails into her palms, writhing with delight as the savage claw-like feeling they gave her. The satyr's next change to her appearance found him gripping her horns in both hands until they darkened to the same contrasting black color as her nails, running his fingers to the tips as each rigid protrusion bent unnaturally in his grasp, curving back over her scalp in a far more exotic, sensual sweep. Next, he touched her eyelids and lips, darkening those too, and tousling his claws through her hair until it faded into an autumnal shade of yellowish-brown, messy and wild. "Oh, you look beautiful, but first we'll need to finish with that delicious skin." Ysera leaned down over her, bringing his mouth to hers and pressing his warm tongue between her lips. She responded eagerly, kissing the beast back as his hands roamed all over her body, feeling an unnatural shiver as her skin was colored by the unnatural magic radiating from them. Her purple night elven body slowly began to take on a reddish-orange hue, glowing with the heat as she felt a faint layer of perspiration forming all over her. When Ysera finally withdrew his tongue from her mouth, her skin was glistening with a fiery, hellish complexion, every muscle shining with a coating of moisture being tensed from her pores. Ysera grinned with wicked delight as she looked down at herself. All of the warm, dun colorings, the mark of her stomach, her piercing, the angle of her horns, they were filled with a wanton excitement as she had never experienced before. She wanted to pounce on the satyr who had done this to her and ride him like an animal. It felt so good to look so bad. Ysera unclasped her shackles one by one, and as Ysera sat up, hands running over her skin and stroking her new horns, touching every inch of her body and feeling the exciting scratch of her long fingernails. Locking eyes with the satyr, she slid up the altar, clasping her arms around his neck to hold himself up as her feet left the floor and wrapped around his waist, crossing behind the demon's back as he pressed himself to the enticing mix of fur and muscle, feeling the slick tip of his member rubbing in between his buttocks. "What do you want to do to me, master?" she purred, biting his lower lip between her teeth. "How can your succubus please you?" He kissed her long and hard, wrapping his wet tongue around hers as he forced it into her mouth, pressing a responsive body against his. "A good succubus knows how to seduce her man," he said, a string of spittle still connecting her glossy black lips to his. "I don't need seducing. I'll have you when I'm ready." "Then who?" she asked, grinning mischievously. She was taking to the game of her own corruption faster by the minute. Just the feeling of having been given her new look gave her the desire to behave more dangerously, and every glimpse she caught of her exotic orange coloring and black highlights only spurred on the fantasy. It was fascinating. It was new. Look down at the road. Ysera's not at the edge of the road, overlooking the path below. Curious, Ysera lowered herself down from her demonic partner's chest and began to cross the clearing, before pausing, thinking better of it. Slowly, back in her master, she ran her tongue over her lips and lowered herself to all fours, sinking sensually onward like a cat as she prowled the rest of the way to the small stone overhang. Between the boughs of the trees in the distance, a lone figure was approaching, a long-eared night elven man holding a heavy pack over his shoulders as he hurried on his way through unwelcoming darkness of Feltwood. Ysera knelt down beside her, laying a clawed hand on her bare back. Seduce him, make a normal man drop everything and take you by the road. Then I'll give you what you want, my emerald princess. To emphasize the point, he held up his thumb and forefinger again, and Ysera saw the orange spark and felt the fire burning in her belly for the briefest of moments as he held them dangerously close together. She gasped, but her brow was furrowed with indecision. She had come here to slake her perverse mortal desires in private, not drag in a helpless man who had done nothing wrong. But the memory of the agonizing stimulation Ysera had inflicted on her and the thrill of the new appearance made her want it with a passion. It was all but a game between them. But the elf coming up the road would have no idea. For all intents and purposes to him, she would be a succubus. She would be able to feel so vividly what it was like for a corrupt temptress to seduce her prey, something even she had never considered outside of her wildest fantasies. The thought of it made up her mind. She let out a wanton purr as she began to clamber down the rocks on the road below. What harm could come of it? It was only sex. Mortals enjoyed it all the time. The elf would probably relish the experience. That's the end.